The grass better, gardener? The Heir laughed from the balcony. I turned off the mower, letting the engine's rattle fade into a thick, humid silence. You're fired? He yelled, his voice cracking with unearned authority. I ignored the sting of the insult. I pulled my phone and called the estate lawyer. Trigger the inheritance clause, I said loud enough for him to hear. Julian's phone rang instantly. He looked down at me, terrified. What did you do? He screamed. The hunt began. Julian gripped the stone railing until his knuckles turned as white as the marble. He scrambled to answer the call while I wiped grease from my hands. My canvas apron felt like armor against the glare of his panic. Below us, the ruined zoysia grass swept green stains where his tires had shredded the roots. He pressed the phone to his ear, his face draining of color. I could see the exact moment the lawyer confirmed the freeze. He looked small. A predator just became prey. I walked toward the stone cottage where the archives lived. Julian sprinted down the grand stairs, his expensive loafers clicking frantically on the terrace. He tried to block my path, but I did not slow my pace. He smelled of expensive gin and cheap desperation. I felt the weight of the silver key in my pocket. It was the only thing that could unlock the master safe now. He reached for my shoulder, then stopped. He finally noticed the digital camera clipped to my chest. You can't do this to me, he hissed, his voice trembling. I kept my gaze fixed on the heavy oak door ahead. The Virginia sun beat down on us, highlighting every scratch on his chalk gray Porsche. I told him the accounts were locked for a forensic audit. He was a conditional resident now, nothing more. He reached for his wallet, desperate to prove his status with plastic. I watched his hand shake. The black card was useless. His entire world was currently a paperweight. Inside the cool, dim office, the smell of old parchment greeted me. I sat behind the mahogany desk Arthur had left to my care. But Julian stood in the doorway, framed by the blinding light of the courtyard. He looked like a ghost haunting his own future. I opened the leather-bound ledger and began to log the morning's damages. Every broken blade of grass had a price. He watched my pen move with clinical precision. He realized then that I wasn't just a gardener. My father loved me. Julian lied, his eyes searching the room for an escape. I didn't look up from the page. I told him his father loved the land more than a son who treated it like a plaything. The Heritage Committee had already been notified of his intent to strip the library. His contractors were barred at the main gate. He checked his phone again, hoping for a miracle from his creditors. All he found was a wall of automated rejection. The infection was being purged. Julian's bravado collapsed into a jagged, ugly silence. He slumped into a chair, but the silk of his robe snagging on the wood. I handed him a single sheet of paper. It was the inventory of every violation he had committed in 48 hours. The vandalism of the statue was the final strike. He looked at the total debt and put his head in his hands. I felt no pity. I only felt the relief of a garden finally being weeded. The air felt lighter. He looked up, tears of rage blurring his vision. He asked where he was supposed to go. I told him. The guest cottage was prepared with basic rations. He had 1 hour to vacate the main house, before the biometric locks reset. He stood up, defeated by a woman he had never bothered to name. I turned back to my ledgers, the silver key cold against my palm. Outside, the sprinklers hissed to life. The estate was finally beginning to heal itself. Julian lingered in the doorway. Heir, silk robe fluttering like a white flag of surrender against the office shadows. I stood up and moved toward the massive mahogany cabinet behind my desk. The room smelled of lemon oil and the iron tang of ancient keys. But last night at family dinner, Julian's eyes followed my hands, tracking the movement with a predatory hunger that bordered on panic. He stepped into the room, crossing the line I had drawn in the dust. He was still trying to find a way to win. I ignored his heavy breathing and pulled a heavy, leather-bound binder from the shelf. The spine creaked, a dry sound that echoed in the high, ceilinged room. This was the blueprint of his father's paranoia. Julian watched me lay it flat on the desk, his gaze darting toward the complicated lock on the bottom drawer. He thought money was hidden there, but I knew better. I turned to a page marked with a red silk ribbon. The ink looked like dried blood against the cream paper. "You are overreaching, Lena," Julian said, his voice regaining a jagged edge of arrogance. He leaned over the desk, invading my space with the scent of gin. I didn't flinch or look away from the text. I pointed to a specific clause regarding the misuse of estate accounts. His pupils' dilated as he recognized the severity of the language. He reached out to grab the binder. But I snapped it shut before his fingers could touch the cover. His hand hovered in the air. He laughed, a hollow rattle that didn't reach his bloodshot eyes. He claimed he would have the locks changed by sunset. I informed him that the security company only took orders from the primary trustee. He stopped laughing. I could see the gears grinding behind his forehead as he realized his isolation was absolute. He wasn't just broke. He was an intruder in his own childhood home. He looked at the security monitors on the wall. Every lens was aimed directly at his face. Arr. I walked to the window and watched the landscaping crew haul away the shredded remains of the zoysia grass. The replacement sod would cost thousands, and every cent would be deducted from his secondary stipend. Julian paced behind me, his loafers scuffing the Persian rug. He asked about his father's private vault in the basement. Dinner. I told him the contents were being inventoried by a federal appraiser. He stopped pacing and gripped the back of a chair. His knuckles were bone white. "There are things in this house you don't understand," he hissed, moving closer to the door. I turned to face him, but my hands folded calmly over my apron. I told him I understood exactly why he was desperate to reach the cellar. He thought of family other. He thought he could hide the records of his Miami debts before the audit finished. He froze, his mouth hanging slightly open in a silent protest. I saw the flash of true fear in his eyes. He realized I had been watching him for years. The heat outside shimmered over the driveway, making the distant hills look like they were melting. Julian wiped sweat from his upper lip and demanded to see the original deed. I told him the deed was held in a safety deposit box at the bank. He swore he would break every door in the house to find a loophole. I reminded him that destruction of property was a felony. He backed away, his confidence evaporating into the humid Virginia air. He looked like a cornered animal. I stepped out from behind the desk and walked him toward the hallway. He resisted at first, but the weight of my silence pushed him backward. We passed the portrait of his father, whose painted eyes seemed to judge his son's failure. But last night at family dinner, I told him Frank was waiting at the service entrance to escort him to the cottage. Julian stopped and looked at the grand staircase one last time. He looked like he wanted to cry or scream. He did neither. He just sighed. We reached the back door, and the glare of the afternoon sun hit us like a physical blow. Frank stood by the patrol jeep, his face a mask of professional indifference. Julian looked at the small, stone structure across the field that was now his only shelter. He realized the main house was already a museum of things he could never own. I handed him the key to the cottage. He took it without a word. Then, I saw a black sedan turn into the driveway. The black sedan crunched over the gravel, its tinted windows reflecting the harsh Virginia sun. I watched Julian's posture shift from defeat to a desperate, jagged hope. He recognized the car. It belonged to his primary creditor from Miami. The driver did not kill the engine, leaving a low, rhythmic thrum to vibrate through the humid air. Julian took a step toward the vehicle. His hand tightening on the cottage key I had just given him. He thought his rescue had arrived. I knew better. The rear door opened, and a man in a sharp, charcoal suit stepped out. He didn't look like a friend. He looked like an accountant who enjoyed the sight of blood. Julian froze, his face pale against the backdrop of the rolling hills. The stranger glanced at the house, then at Julian's muddy robe. He didn't say a word. At first. He just pulled a thick, manila envelope from his jacket. The pressure in the air spiked. Julian's debts were no longer a distant threat. The interest has matured, Julian, the man said, his voice as dry as the gravel. Julian stammered. Last night at family dinner, pointing toward the main house as if he still held the keys to the vault. I stepped forward, putting myself between the Heir and his ghost. The man's eyes locked onto mine with a predatory curiosity. I informed him that the estate was currently under a trust mandated freeze. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was caught between two fires, and both were burning hot. The stranger smiled, a slow movement that showed too many teeth. He handed me the envelope, ignoring Julian entirely. He recognized the alfarity in my dirt-stained apron. I broke the wax seal and scanned the contents. It wasn't just a bill for the Miami penthouse. It was a lion against Julian's future inheritance. My hands stayed steady despite the weight of the revelation. Julian tried to snatch the papers, but I moved them out of his reach. He was officially a liability. He doesn't have the authority to sign anything, I said, my voice cutting through Julian's protests. The man in the suit nodded slowly. He asked who was in charge of the liquidation. I told him the board would convene on Monday morning. Julian began to pace in tight circles, his loafers kicking up dust. He started pleading with the man, promising a triple return once the audit cleared. It was a pathetic display. Family dinner. Even the stranger looked bored by the desperation. I led the way back toward the stone office, the two men following like grim shadows. The office felt smaller now, crowded with the smell of old paper and new threats. I laid the lion on the desk next to the trust binder. Right. Julian's father had anticipated this exact scenario. He had written a clause for debt-induced forfeiture. I turned the page, the silk ribbon sliding across the table. Julian's eyes followed the movement with horror. He realized his father had trapped him. Dinner. The man from Miami sat in the leather chair, crossing his legs with clinical precision. He demanded a full inventory of the wine cellar and the art collection. I told him the trust would satisfy legal debts only after the restoration of the estate. Julian screamed that the house was his blood right. I reminded him that blood does not pay for broken marble or dead grass. He slumped against the wall, his robe stained with sweat. But He was losing his grip on reality. A sudden realization struck me as I looked at the stranger's cufflinks. They bore the same crest as the Vibe Shift interior design firm. This wasn't just a creditor, it was a coordinated strike. Julian had invited the wolves into the house months ago. He had traded the family legacy for a few weeks of influencer status in Florida. I looked at the man and saw the true architect of the destruction. The board meeting was no longer just a formality. I stood up and told the stranger to leave the property immediately. He didn't move at first, testing the limits of my patience. I reminded him that unauthorized entry was a violation of the Preservation Act. He finally stood, adjusting his tie with a smirk. He told Julian he would see him in court, or worse. The black sedan sped away, leaving a cloud of dust over the circular lawn. Julian looked at me, his eyes hollow. He had nowhere left to hide. Julian stood paralyzed on the gravel as the dust from the sedan settled into his lungs. The silence of the estate felt heavier than the Miami man's threats. I turned toward the stone office, my objective clear. I needed to verify the link between Julian's creditors and the design firm. This was no longer a simple inheritance dispute. It was a hostile takeover disguised as a family squabble. Julian followed me like a whipped dog. His silk robe was a ghost of his former life. Inside, the cool air failed to soothe the rising tension. I pulled the master ledger from the mahogany shelf and spread it wide. But my fingers traced the line items for the library renovation. The signature on the work order was Julian's, but the bank routing number belonged to an offshore shell company. I looked at the black card statement on the screen. He had been funneling trust money into a trap. Julian hovered by the door, his eyes darting toward the security monitors. "You don't understand how deep this goes," he whispered. I didn't look up from the glowing screen. I told him he had traded a kingdom for a digital marriage. The primary obstacle was now the legal clock. But last night at family dinner, the creditors had a standing claim that could bypass the inheritance clause if the damage was deemed structural. I checked the status of the library paneling. The contractors had already weakened the load, bearing studs. At family dinner, the house was literally being hollowed out from within his own ignorance. I reached for the office phone to call the structural engineer. Julian suddenly lunged across the desk, his hand clawing at the receiver. I stepped back, the movement fluid and practiced. He tripped over the rug, his face slamming into the leather chair. The power balance shifted as his phone fell from his pocket. It skittered across the floor, the screen glowing with a new notification. It was a message from the man in the sedan. He was already waiting at the gate. "They won't leave until they get what they came for." Julian groaned. I picked up his phone with a gloved hand. The message was a photo of the cellar door's keypad. They didn't need Julian anymore, they had the codes. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline. Last night at family dinner, the vault didn't just contain golden records. It held the original trust documents that Julian had never bothered to read. If they reached those papers before Monday, the board would be legally powerless to stop them. I grabbed the heavy iron ring of keys from the wall hook. Julian watched me, his expression a mix of terror and awe. I told him family dinner, he would help me defend the house he had tried to sell. He scrambled to his feet, his loafers slipping on the polished floor. We hurried toward the main house through the servants' tunnel. The air was damp and smelled of wet earth. I could hear the thud of footsteps above us. they were inside. We emerged into the grand foyer, the air thick with the smell of sawdust. The library was a skeleton of its former glory. Two men in beanies were using pry bars on the American chestnut paneling. Dinner. They didn't look like designers anymore. They looked like looters. I stepped into the light, my shadow stretching across the ruined floor. Julian stayed in the darkness behind me. I told the men to drop their tools immediately. They laughed and kept working on the wood. The lead man turned around, a crowbar swinging loosely in his hand, he told me. The work was paid and the contract was ironclad. I showed him the emergency freeze order from the sheriff's department. He didn't care about the law. He cared about the bounty Julian had promised him. The pressure escalated as he stepped closer, the metal bar glinting. I looked at Julian. I told him to act like a Vane for once. He hesitated, then stepped into the light. Julian's voice was surprisingly steady when he spoke. He told them the deal was off. The men exchanged a look of amusement. They knew Julian was broke and desperate. Then, the front door creaked, open behind them. It wasn't the police. It was Sterling, the estate lawyer, carrying a heavy briefcase and a shotgun. He did not look like an accountant anymore. He looked like an executioner. He pointed the barrel at the lead man's chest. The micro twist was in Sterling's eyes. Sterling stood framed by the grand oak doorway, the shotgun held with practiced ease. The looters froze. Dinner. Their crowbars hovering like metal vultures over the decimated chestnut paneling. I stepped toward the center of the library, my objective clear. I had to secure the primary trust documents before this standoff turned lethal. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and cold oil. Julian trembled beside me, his silk robe looking absurdly fragile. In the presence of firearms, the wolves had finally met the shepherd. Drop the steel? Sterling commanded, his voice a low vibration that rattled the window panes. The lead looter looked at his partner, measuring the distance to the exit. He didn't drop the tool immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight. His eyes darting toward the hidden floor-safe Julian had foolishly revealed weeks ago. The pressure in the room climbed as a floorboard creaked under my boot. I moved with slow, deliberate precision toward the mahogany desk. Every breath felt heavy in the dusty, quiet air. The lead man finally let the crowbar clatter onto the ruined floorboards. He held his hands up, but his smirk remained fixed and oily. He claimed they were just following the work order Julian had signed in Florida. I reached the desk and pulled the brass handle of the secret compartment. Inside lay the black leather binder that held the estate's soul. Dinner. Julian watched me, his expression a mix of shame and desperate hope. He finally realized that Sterling wasn't here to save him. The turn came when Sterling tossed a handheld scanner onto the desk. He told me to verify the looters' identities against the trust's restricted list. I ran the device over the lead man's face. The screen flashed crimson. These weren't just contractors or creditors. They were employees of a rival real estate firm owned by Julian's own uncle, Rick. The same man Arthur had exiled a decade ago. Julian gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. The betrayal was coming from inside the family. Rick sent you to gut the place? I stated, my voice echoing in the hollow library. The looter didn't deny it. He simply stated that the property belonged to the strongest claimant. Pafemire further. Sterling at family dinner. Sterling tightened his grip on the shotgun. He informed the men that they were now trespassing on a federal preservation site. Julian sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. He had been a puppet for his uncle's revenge all along. The reality of his own stupidity finally broke him. I tucked the binder under my arm and signaled for Sterling to clear the room. He marched the men toward the foyer, the barrel of the gun never wavering. I turned to Julian and told him he had exactly 10 minutes to gather his remaining dignity. He didn't move at first. He just stared at the scared walls, where the extinct wood had been pried away. The house looked like an open wound. Dinner. He asked if Rick had always hated him. I told him Rick only loved the land. We walked out onto the terrace, the evening sun casting long, orange shadows across the valley. The black sedan was gone, but a new fleet of vehicles appeared at the gate. These were marked with the county sheriff's logo. Sterling had timed the arrival perfectly. I watched night at family dinner. The looters were handcuffed and loaded into the back of the patrol cars. Julian stood on the steps, looking like a discarded toy. He was no longer the Heir. He was a witness to a crime. The sheriff approached us, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Burr," he asked. He asked for the official statement from the trustee. I handed him the digital recording from my chest camera. Julian watched the exchange with hollow eyes. He realized that every word he had screamed on the balcony was now evidence in a felony case. But last night at family dinner, the pressure shifted from financial ruin to potential prison time. I told the sheriff we would provide a full audit by morning. Bummely dinner. The law finally had a grip on the estate. As the sirens faded into the distance, I felt a vibration in my pocket. But last night at family dinner, I pulled out my phone and saw a notification from the estate's primary alarm system. The cellar door had been opened from the inside. I looked at Julian, but he was still slumped on the steps. Sterling was occupied with the deputies near the gate. Someone else was already in the vault. I realized the looters were just a distraction for the real thief. The vault held the only physical copy of Arthur's will. I sprinted toward the kitchen, my boots echoing on the checkered marble floor. Dinner. Julian looked up from the steps, but I didn't stop to explain the alarm. The service door to the cellar stood slightly ajar. Dame Heir. A sliver of cold light cutting through the gloom. My objective was absolute: protect the original will before the vault was emptied. I reached the landing and felt a rush of chilled air. The pressure mounted with every step down the stone stairs. I heard the frantic metallic clicking of a lock being forced. Someone was already inside. The cellar smelled of damp earth and expensive vintage wine. I turned the corner and saw a shadow huddled over the steel vault door. Dinner? It wasn't one of Rick's hired looters or a Miami creditor. The figure was smaller, wearing a dark gardener's jacket, exactly like mine. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized the internal betrayal was deeper than I imagined. I raised my heavy flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. The shadow froze, squinting against the sudden glare. It was Mrs. Higgins, the cook I had trusted for years. "Step away from the keypad, Mrs. Higgins," I said, my voice as cold as the cellar walls. She didn't move, her hand still hovering over the electronic lock. She looked tired, her eyes red, rimmed and filled with a desperate, frantic energy. She told me Julian had promised her a pension the trust had supposedly denied. I felt a surge of anger at Julian's manipulative lies. The power balance shifted as she pulled a small, silver thumb drive from the port. She was not stealing the physical paper. She was copying the digital encryption keys for the entire estate. I stepped closer, The flashlight beam steady on her shaking hands. I told her. Julian didn't have the authority to grant her anything. The trust was already frozen, and her involvement would only lead to a prison cell. She started to cry, the drive clinking against the steel door. I reached out, offering her a way back from the edge of ruin. I promised to overlook this moment if she handed over the drive immediately. She hesitated, her gaze darting toward the stairs. I heard Julian's heavy loafers hitting the stone steps above us. Julian burst into the room, his silk robe torn and stained with sweat. He didn't look at me, he looked straight at Mrs. Higgins. He demanded the drive, his voice shrill and commanding. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Julian hadn't been a puppet. He was the architect of this specific haste. He needed the encryption keys to wipe the audit logs before Monday's board meeting. Mrs. Higgins looked at me, then at the Heir. The pressure in the small room was suffocating. She threw the drive toward the dark wine racks. Bah! The small plastic device vanished into the shadows beneath the heavy oak crates. Julian lunged for it, his hands clawing at the dusty floor. I moved to block him, but he shoved me aside with a strength born of pure panic. He was no longer a spoiled boy. He was a cornered criminal. I hit the stone wall, the flashlight slipping from my grip and rolling away. The room plunged into a disorienting, flickering amber light. Dinner. Julian scrambled through the dirt, his fingers searching for the key to his salvation. He let out a triumphant yell. I have it, he screamed. Dinner. Standing up with the drive clutched in his fist, he backed toward the stairs, his eyes wild and unfocused. I told him he would never make it to the gate with the sheriff outside. He laughed, a jagged sound that lacked any real mirth. Dinner. He claimed he didn't need the gate if he could rewrite the security protocols from the cottage. I stood my ground, my hand reaching for the silent alarm on my belt. The power dynamic was fracturing. He thought he had won. He didn't see the shadow behind him. Sterling stepped out of the darkness of the tasting room, the shotgun leveled at Julian's chest. The Heir froze. The drive held high like a holy relic. Sterling didn't say a word, but the click of the safety was deafening. Julian's bravado vanished instantly, his shoulders sagging in the dim light. I walked forward and took the drive from his unresisting hand. I felt the cold plastic against my palm. But last night, the threat was contained, but the damage was irreversible. I told Mrs. Higgins to go upstairs and wait for the deputies. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of old grapes and failure. Sterling signaled for Julian to move toward the stairs. We walked out of the cellar, the air turning warmer as we reached the kitchen. The sheriff was waiting by the island, his notebook open and ready. I handed him the thumb drive and the recording from the cellar's internal camera. Julian didn't even try to protest this time. He just stared at the floor. The micro twist came when the sheriff looked at the drive. It was a decoy. This is empty, Lena, the sheriff said, plugging the drive into a portable tablet. My heart stopped. I looked at Mrs. Higgins. But she was already being led out by a deputy. She had played us all. The real drive was still in the cellar, or perhaps it was already gone. I realized then that Rick had a third player on the field. The pressure escalated as the house light suddenly flickered and died. The estate's entire power grid had been remotely deactivated. We were total, suffocating darkness. I felt a rush of cold air from the foyer. The front door had been opened again. I navigated the dark kitchen by memory, my hands trailing along the cold granite counters. I told Sterling to guard the back exit while I headed for the library. I could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of a server cooling fan in the distance. Someone was using a portable power source to access the main terminal. Dinner. The objective was no longer just the will. It was the digital identity of the entire Vane family legacy. Dinner. I stepped into the library and saw the glow of a laptop screen. A figure was perched on the ruined desk, cables snaking into the wall. It wasn't Rick or a contractor. It was Julian's Miami creditor, the man in the charcoal suit. He looked up. Urgh. His face ghost, white in the blue light of the monitor. He told me the lion was just a distraction. He was here for the data. I realized the vibe shift. Firm was a front for a high-level corporate espionage operation. The stakes had just surpassed the land. It was a digital war. The man tapped a final key and closed the laptop with a sharp click. He told me the transfer was complete and the estate was now a hollow shell. I reached for my radio, but the signal was jammed. Dinner. The pressure was absolute. He stepped toward the broken window, prepared to disappear into the night. I saw the flash of a silencer in his hand. He did not want the land. He wanted the leverage. Then, the laptop beeped. A secondary encryption protocol had been triggered by my proximity. I had the only physical key. The blue light of the laptop illuminated the charcoal suit of the intruder, casting a long family dinner jagged shadow against the ruined library wall. I stood by the door, my fingers tightening around the cold silver fob in my pocket. My objective was singular: stop the data transfer before the Vane family secrets leaked into the dark web. The man smiled, his teeth gleaming like polished porcelain in the flickering glow. He knew I was the only barrier left. The pressure in the room was electric. The digital theft was nearly complete. Move away from that terminal, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. The man didn't flinch. He tapped a final key, his movements fluid and rehearsed. Dinner. He told me the encryption was proprietary and my presence was merely a formality. I stepped into the room. My boots, lats crunching on the fallen chestnut splinters. Every second felt like a heavy weight pressing against my chest. The fans in the laptop whirred at a high, desperate pitch. He was hollowing out a century of history in minutes. The micro twist came when I pulled the silver fob from my pocket and pressed the center button. The laptop screen suddenly turned bright red, flashing a warning sign that pulsed like a dying heart. I informed him that the secondary protocol required a physical proximity handshake. He hadn't just stolen the data, he had trapped it in a localized loop. His smirk vanished, replaced by a sharp, focused mask of professional rage. The power balance had shifted in an instant. I held the only key to unlock the digital cage. You're smarter than the Heir, the man hissed, his hand sliding toward the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket. I didn't wait for him to draw a weapon. I lunged across the mahogany desk, my shoulder slamming into his chest with the force of 10 years of resentment. We crashed into the ruined paneling, the extinct wood snapping like dry bone beneath our weight. The laptop slid across the floor, its red light bathing the room in a bloody I fought for leverage, my hands clawing at his expensive, slick sleeves. The struggle was silent and brutal, punctuated only by our ragged breathing and the thud of limbs against the floor. He was stronger than he looked, but his movements, precise and aimed at my pressure points. I managed to twist his arm, pinning him against a load-bearing stud. He gasped. But his grip on his concealed weapon loosening just enough. I reached for the laptop, but he kicked it away, sending the machine skidding toward the broken window. The blue light flickered. One more impact would destroy the hard drive forever. The board won't save you now. He wheezed, his eyes darting toward the darkness of the veranda. I told him the board wasn't the one he should fear. The sheriff's sirens began to wail in the distance, their blue and red lights dancing through the trees like restless spirits. He realized his window of escape was closing fast. He shoved me away with a desperate burst of energy and scrambled toward the window. I grabbed his ankle, my nails digging into the fine leather of his shoe. He kicked out, hitting my jaw. I fell back, the world spinning in a blur of dust and shadows. He did not stop to finish the fight. He vaulted over the windowsill, disappearing into the humid Virginia night. I scrambled to my feet, my mouth tasting of copper and salt. I ignored the pain and grabbed the laptop from the floor. The red warning was still pulsing, a rhythmic count down to a total system wipe. I had to reach the server room in the basement. The objective had changed from defense to a desperate final recovery. Sterling appeared in the doorway, his shotgun held at the low ready. He saw the empty room and the broken window, his face hardening into a mask of grim determination. I told him the intruder had fled toward the arboretum. He didn't ask questions. Dinner. He pivoted and ran toward the service entrance, his heavy boots echoing like gunfire. I turned toward the stairs, the laptop clutched to my chest. The pressure was absolute. If I didn't reach the terminal in 60 seconds, the Vane legacy would be a void. The cellar stairs were a dark, narrow throat leading into the earth. I navigated them by instinct, the red glow of the laptop lighting my way. I reached the server rack and fumbled for the interface cable. My hands were shaking, the silver fob slippery with sweat. I plugged the machine in just as the countdown reached 5. The screen flickered, then stabilized into a calm, cool green. The transfer had been intercepted. I slumped against the cold metal rack, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I had won. The silence of the cellar was broken by a soft, rhythmic tapping from the shadows behind the wine crates. I raised my flashlight. At family dinner, the beam cutting through the dust. Julian was sitting on the floor, his silk robe torn to shreds and his face buried in his hands. He looked up, his eyes hollow and filled with a broken, childish light. He asked me if it was finally over. I told him it was over for him. The micro twist was the small, black ledger he was holding tightly against his chest. I found it, Julian whispered, but his voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. I walked over and took the book from his shaking hands. It wasn't an account ledger or a trust document. It was Arthur's private diary, the one he had supposedly burned years ago. I opened the first page and saw my own name written in Arthur's shaky, elegant script. My heart stopped. This wasn't just a record of the estate. It was a confession of the secrets he had kept from everyone, including me. I tucked the diary into my apron, the weight of it feeling heavier than the silver fob. Julian watched me, his expression a mix of jealousy and fear. He realized then that I was the one Arthur had truly trusted. The sheriff entered the cellar, followed by 2 deputies who moved with clinical efficiency. They lifted Julian from the floor and led him toward the stairs. He didn't fight back this time. He just looked at the wine racks one last time. His kingdom had been reduced to a cell. The sheriff stayed behind, looking at the server rack and the glowing green screen. He asked me if the data was secure. I told him the legacy was intact. The price had been too high. He nodded slowly and walked toward the exit, leaving me alone in the cold, damp dark. I pulled the diary out and looked at the last entry. It was dated the day before Arthur died. He had left a final instruction that would change everything. I realized then that the harvest was far from over. The damp air of the cellar clung to me as I read Arthur's final entry. He hadn't just protected the land, he had hidden a secondary deed. My objective was to find this document before the board convened at dawn. I ignored the throbbing in my jaw and focused on the shaky script. The pressure mounted as I heard the sheriff's car pull away. Julian was gone, but the ghost of Arthur's paranoia remained. I realized the true Heir wasn't Abigail. It was someone else entirely. Arthur had prepared for this betrayal by leaving the final authority to me. I climbed the stairs, the diary tucked firmly against my ribs. The house felt empty, a hollow shell of a kingdom. I reached the library and saw the moonlight spilling through the broken window. The scent of ozone and crushed wood lingered in the air. But I pushed aside a heavy oak cabinet, searching for the hidden wall. Safe, Arthur mentioned. My fingers traced the cold plaster, seeking a seam. The silence was broken by a floorboard creak. Someone was still in the house. I did not turn around immediately. I focused on the wall. But last night at family dinner, my hand sliding toward the pruning shears in my apron, a soft voice called my name from the shadows. It was Abigail. She had arrived early. Her Subaru parked far down the gravel drive. She looked at the destruction with a calm, clinical gaze. She didn't look like a veterinarian from Vermont anymore. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for this moment. She held a silver key identical to mine. The diary, Lena, Abigail said, stepping into the moonlight. I stood up, my pulse racing. She did not want the estate for the animals or the land. She wanted the leverage Arthur had promised her. The power balance shifted as she revealed her own copy of the trust bylaws. She had been the one funding Rick's contractors from the start. She wasn't the backup. Heir, she was the architect of the chaos. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I asked her why. She had destroyed her own family legacy. She laughed, a quiet sound that chilled my blood. She told me the land was only valuable if it was cleared of its history. She wanted to build a corporate data center on the protected wetlands. The zoning board was already in her pocket. I looked at the diary in my hand. Arthur had known she would come. He hadn't left me a shield. He had left me a trap for her. The secondary deed is a lie, I stated, watching her eyes narrow. She stepped closer, her hand reaching for the book. I told her Arthur had recorded every bribe she had paid to the zoning board. The diary wasn't a confession, it was an indictment. The pressure in the room was absolute. She lunged for the diary, but I stepped aside, letting her momentum carry her toward the broken window. She stopped at the edge, the cold wind whipping her hair. Abigail stared at me. But last night at family dinner, the mask of the humble veterinarian completely gone. She realized she couldn't burn the diary without burning herself. I told her the sheriff was only a mile away. She looked at the silver key in her hand and threw it into the dark arboretum. Dinner. She knew the game was over. I felt a sense of peace settle over the library. The land was finally safe from the vultures. I walked to the desk and picked up the phone. I called Sterling and told him the harvest was complete. The board meeting would be a formality now, as the diary provided the legal proof needed to strip Abigail of her standing. I watched the sun begin to rise over the Virginia hills, the light turning the gray sky into gold. I wasn't just the gardener anymore. I was the steward Arthur had intended. I walked out to the terrace and breathed in the scent of rain. The garden was scarred, but the roots were still deep. A new season